Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that feels incredibly relevant, maybe even unavoidable right now: bias. Where does it truly come from? How deep do its roots really go? And, is it something we're just stuck with, or can we actually do something about it?
Big questions.
They are. And to explore them, we've been digging into the book Breaking Bias by Anu Gupta. It also includes a foreword by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So our mission in this deep dive is really to pull out the most powerful insights from this source. We want to understand the origins of stereotypes, prejudice, see how they show up both out in the world and, well, inside us,
Yeah.
and maybe discover some of the science-backed approaches the book suggests for beginning to unravel them.
And I think it's crucial to get right up front why this matters so much, which the source really emphasizes.
Mm.
Bias isn't just abstract. It has a profound impact on, well, everything. How we live our daily lives, our workplaces, our communities,
Mhm.
even how we relate to ourselves, to other people, to nature, to life itself. It's genuinely at the heart of so many challenges we face.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. What's the fundamental argument the book is making about bias? What's at its core?
At its core, the idea from the source is actually pretty straightforward, but deeply impactful. It's that bias is learned.
Learn. All right.
Yes. And here's the really key part. It's rooted not just in, cold logic or reason, but fundamentally in emotions and in our habits of the mind. The source even uses the Sanskrit term vedana to really highlight the role of feelings, of sensation.
Didana. Interesting.
And because it's something we learn, something we pick up like a skill almost,
Mm-hmm.
it means, crucially, it can be unlearned. The book approaches this not as some kind of moral failing,
Yeah.
but more as a set of ingrained patterns that we can actually understand and actively work to change.
That's interesting. The book apparently asks readers right at the start to connect with their feelings about bias, not just their rational thoughts on it. Why lead with emotion like that?
Well, the source argues that if bias were purely a rational thing, right, we could just throw facts and data at it, and poof, problem solved.
Yeah, libraries are full of that research.
Exactly. But it persists precisely because it's tangled up with our emotional responses, those deep-seated mental habits. The automatic associations, the concepts and feelings that just sort of fire off. It's these habitual emotional reactions, often operating below our conscious awareness, that really drive bias.
So the book is really firm on this idea, then we aren't just born biased.
Absolutely firm. The source is crystal clear. Nobody is born prejudiced. Biases are acquired. You learn them, just like you learn to, ride a bike or follow a recipe.
Okay.
Think about common stereotypes. The idea that, say, people from a certain region are lazy, or maybe that women aren't good at math, or a particular group is inherently untrustworthy.
Right.
Those aren't hardwired into our DNA. They're learned associations, beliefs passed down through culture, through experience.
And because they're learned, there's a way to unlearn them. What does the source suggest for doing that?
Precisely. If it's learned behavior, it can become unlearned behavior. So the book introduces this framework. It's called the PRISM Toolkit. Yeah, it stands for perspective taking, prosocial behaviors, individuation, stereotype replacement, and mindfulness.
Okay.
These are presented as practical tools to actually begin that unlearning process. The source even uses this really powerful phrase, neurodecolonization.
Wow. Neurodecolonization.
Yeah. It describes the work of cleansing our minds, our bodies really, of these unhelpful habitual biases and actively cultivating more skillful, more inclusive ways of thinking and feeling. And it suggests starting with mindfulness to build that initial awareness.
It sounds like this work is framed as incredibly important. You mentioned the source suggests breaking bias might be the most crucial task of the 21st century. That's quite a claim.
It is a big claim. And the book frames it that way because from its perspective, bias affects everything. It's not just about, individual awkward interactions. It shapes our systems, our communities, our relationship with ourselves, and our relationship with the rest of the living world, animals, nature, the planet. To build a world where belonging and connection are the default, the source argues, we simply have to address bias at its deepest roots. It's seen as foundational work for any kind of better future.
And part of starting that work, according to the source, is simply imagining that world. It encourages us to start right there.
Yes, exactly. It emphasizes the power of moral imagination and will. The source basically asks, look, if humanity can mobilize the imagination and resources to envision something as complex as, say, colonizing Mars,
Right.
why can't we apply that same imaginative power to envisioning and then actually creating a world free from bias? It connects this to a broader shift, the source mentions, moving from an information age to an imagination age,
Imagination age.
where our capacity to envision new possibilities becomes paramount.
Okay, so to understand why bias is so deep-seated, the book takes us back in history. What were some of those really early systems or frameworks that kind of set the stage?
Yeah, the source points out that as societies got more centralized, especially thinking about Europe and the Middle East, this consciousness of exclusion started to, well, harden. It highlights two really influential historical frameworks that basically build hierarchies.
Okay, what were they?
One was the Great Chain of Being, which was dominant in European Christendom. The other was the dhimmi system, which developed as the Islamic world expanded.
All right, let's start with the Great Chain of Being. What exactly was that?
So the source describes it as this theological concept. It drew on ideas from ancient Greece and Rome, and it became just a dominant way of seeing the world in European culture for centuries. It literally pictured all of existence as a kind of ladder or a chain. You had God at the very top,
Right.
then angels, then humans. And the source specifically notes, European Christian men were often implicitly placed at the peak of the human part of the chain. Then animals below them, plants, inanimate objects at the bottom. The key insight here is how this framework provided the conceptual justification for social hierarchies. And, critically, the idea that those higher up the chain, especially humans, had a right to dominate and exploit everything and everyone below them, including nature itself.
Wow.
The source calls it a master conceptual puppeteer of social engineering. It shaped how people saw their place, and crucially the place of others, in this very rigid structure.
And the dhimmi system, how did that work as a framework for exclusion?
Well, as Islam spread, the dhimmi system emerged. It essentially created a hierarchy based on religion. People of the book, mostly Christians and Jews, were generally allowed to practice their faith under Islamic rule, but often as second-class citizens, they typically had to pay a specific tax, the jizya. The source notes that while this sometimes led to a degree of tolerance, maybe out of necessity needing their skills or taxes, or maybe just to maintain a sense of superiority for the ruling group, it was fundamentally a system of subordination based on religious identity. And as Islam expanded further east, encountering diverse faiths like Yazidis, Zoroastrians, Hindus, Buddhist groups, not traditionally seen as people of the book, this framework often led to, well, initially periods of intense violence or marginalization before some groups might have been later, sometimes reluctantly, folded into similar dhimmi-like arrangements.
So both systems, in different ways, provided these structured methods for categorizing people, beings, into us and them, with inherent rankings built in.
Exactly. That's the core function. And the source is careful to point out the lasting impact, the historical trauma. For example, the experiences of non-Muslim groups under certain applications of these principles can sometimes, it argues, fuel modern phenomena like Islamophobia. The source even brings in this term wetiko.
Wetiko?
Yeah, it's a concept from some indigenous cultures. It describes this sort of cannibalistic mind virus, an embodiment of separation, greed, consuming the life force of others. The source uses it to talk about that deep sense of separation that underlies bias.
And that historical mindset, that hierarchy and separation, didn't just affect human interactions, did it? The source connects it to our relationship with nature, too.
Oh, absolutely. This anthropocentric exclusion, seeing humans, or really specific dominant groups of humans, as superior was used to justify horrific things, like theriocides, the mass slaughter of animals,
And ecocide.
environmental destruction.
Zoreicide.
Yeah. The source uses the really powerful example of the near extinction of the American buffalo. These animals were central to many indigenous societies, but they were systematically wiped out, partly to clear land for white settlers. But the source connects this destruction not just to practical reasons like land, but explicitly to wetiko, that profound sense of separation from indigenous people, from more than human beings, and from the earth itself.
I think I've seen those images, the piles of buffalo skulls.
Yes, the book mentions that image. It becomes this visceral symbol of the sheer scale of bias enacted against the natural world, stemming from that sense of human supremacy.
What's fascinating, and maybe disturbing, is how these historical systems, these blueprints for hierarchy, seem to have created the infrastructure for the biases we still grapple with.
That's exactly the insight the source offers. They weren't just things that happened way back when. They provided the foundational ideas, the structures, upon which later forms of bias were built, and often layered right on top of existing exclusion systems in other parts of the world during colonization.
Okay, so let's bring this forward to today. The book identifies 5 core root causes that create and sustain identity-based bias now. Can we start with the first 2? Story and policies.
Right. So the source says the number one root cause is a story, or really the collection of pervasive stories that circulate in a culture. Yeah, these stories act like the conceptual scaffolding. They provide the justification, often implicitly, for creating these secondary identity-based hierarchies, these systems that rank human value, saying some groups are inherently better or worse than others. And here's a crucial point the source really hammers home.
Well,
These stories are, almost without exception, made up. They have no basis in actual science or objective reality.
made up. Can you give a clear example from the book of how a story creates that ranking?
Well, there's that anecdote mentioned about the prince who meets a Malaysian student and makes a joke about curries.
Okay.
This student, the source notes, was actually a brilliant biophysicist and pilot, but in that moment, her entire complex identity got reduced to a food stereotype. That reduction comes directly from a story, a learned association that ranks her identity based on this simplistic, biased narrative.
Right, reducing someone to one thing.
Exactly. Or think about the classic surgeon riddle. You know the one. Father and son in a car crash. Father dies. Son rushed to hospital. Surgeon says, I can't operate. He's my son.
Yeah, I know it.
The reason many people pause is because the story we hold, the learned association, is that surgeons are typically male. It prevents us from immediately thinking the surgeon is the boy's mother. Simple examples, but they show how these made-up stories limit our perception.
So these often fictional stories become the actual lens through which we view and judge other people.
Precisely. And that brings us to the second root cause, policies. Policies are what take those often baseless stories and give them real, concrete power in society.
How so?
Policies are the formal rules, the principles, the actions that bind people and institutions. They're meant to set standards, manage society, resolve disputes, all that. But they're almost always deeply informed by those underlying stories about hierarchy and difference.
So policies kind of formalize the bias inherent in the stories.
That's a great way to put it. The source gives lots of examples. Historically, think about policies that mandated marriage only within specific ethnic or religious groups. Those came directly from stories about needing to maintain purity or uphold a certain hierarchy. Or think about workplace dress codes, often rooted in unspoken stories about what looks professional, which frequently ties back to class or dominant cultural norms.
Or even things happening now, like banning books.
Exactly. Government policies banning certain books or restricting access to bathrooms based on gender identity, these sprout directly from underlying stories about who is considered proper or what ideas are deemed dangerous.
The source also discusses casteism in South Asia. It's fundamentally rooted in a story, a narrative, of intrinsic impurity and inherited hierarchy. Policies formalize this for centuries.
Right.
And even though it's legally banned in many places now, it persists culturally because the story is still believed and informally enforced through people's actions and social structures. Anti-Semitism is another powerful example used. Fabricated stories portraying Jewish people as inherently greedy or secretly controlling the world led directly to policies pushing them to the margins, restricting their professions, and ultimately to horrific violence.
And that hasn't gone away. No, the source knows how this pattern continues today, with Jewish people sometimes scapegoated for vast global problems, echoing those same old, baseless stories. And religious extremism, really of any kind, whether it's Islamic, Hindu, Sikh, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, whatever, it's always built on an us versus them story. And that story then gets translated into policies or actions that create hierarchies or deny rights based purely on religious identity.
It's not just about those big identity categories either, is it? The book mentions professional identities, too.
Yes, even our professional identities have stories and policies tied to them, often linked to class. The author shares his own experience choosing public interest law, which paid vastly less than private firms, despite the skills or societal benefit involved. That reflects a societal story about what kind of labor is considered valuable, a story formalized by economic policies that tend to prioritize financial accumulation above other forms of contribution.
It's really striking how these often completely fictional narratives get written into the actual rule book of society through policies.
Exactly. They become embedded. They shape the structure of how things work day to day.
Okay, moving on to the last 3 root causes. The book identifies these seem to be about how bias is transmitted. They are social contact, education, and media. How does our daily social contact train us?
Well, the source explains it right from the beginning. From when we're tiny, we're absorbing cues. These are concepts, emotions, those feelings, or Vedana we talked about. We get them from our immediate environment, from the significant people around us, family, teachers, friends, the community. And just through constant repetition, these cues become ingrained. They form the automatic lens, that sort of system one fast thinking.
Right, the shortcuts.
The shortcuts, exactly. The lens through which we perceive different people and automatically assign meaning to their identities, reinforcing those us versus them stories we just discussed.
Does the book give examples of this social training?
Oh yeah, some really stark ones. There's the image described of white women yelling racial slurs at a 6-year-old black child, Ruby Bridges, integrating a school while holding their own babies.
Wow.
It's such a visceral picture of how intense emotional cues and bias are transmitted directly through social interaction from one generation to the next. Or the author mentions his uncle expressing quite ingrained classist views about poor people. These weren't abstract beliefs, they reflected the hierarchies and stories embedded in his uncle's social world. Our interactions are powerful training grounds. And the source notes it's not just direct interactions with people. Our physical spaces, even virtual ones, matter too. Think about segregated neighborhoods or online filter bubbles. They reinforce divisions and the biases linked to them simply through repeated exposure and lack of counterexposure.
Okay, what about education? How does the formal education system act as a root cause?
So when the source talks about education here, it's focusing specifically on the formal systems we've generally been part of. It argues that modern educational systems, influenced by historical models like the Prussian system, were just about teaching, reading, writing, arithmetic.
What else were they doing?
Often subtly, sometimes overtly. They were also designed to train people in things like obedience, nationalism, a sense of separation from and often superiority over other groups, and even nature. And the formation of hierarchical identities based on age, gender, class, and increasingly things like race, ethnicity, religion.
Can you give an example of that from the source?
The author shares his personal experience of going through school and university and not learning about the devastating Bengali famine of 1943, an event caused directly by British wartime policies that killed millions until he was in college.
He didn't learn about it before college.
No. Despite its scale and significance, the education system he was part of simply didn't include that history or that perspective. It reinforced a particular incomplete narrative. Another concept mentioned is the school-to-prison pipeline.
Right, I've heard that term.
Where children, disproportionately from marginalized backgrounds, are pushed out of schools and into the juvenile and criminal justice systems. This reflects how the system itself labels, treats, and ultimately funnels different identities down different paths. Education systems often implicitly, sometimes explicitly, teach whose stories matter, whose histories are important, and which identities are seen as valuable, versus which are seen as problematic or less than.
And the final one, media, news, entertainment, social media. How does the source see media training us in bias?
The source argues that modern media is potentially the most powerful training mechanism of all today, simply because it's so constant, so pervasive. It trains us by essentially controlling the stories we are saturated with day in and day out. Think about it. Before mass media, stories spread mainly person to person, or through local art, song, theater. And often the stories that resonated most, the ones rooted in shared humanity or inclusion, were the ones that survived and spread. But with the rise of mass media print, then broadcast, now digital, the survival of the fittest story shifted. It became more like survival of the richest, or maybe survival of the loudest. Stories became controlled by those with the platforms, the resources. And often, those stories prioritize conflict, sensation, stereotypes, because that grabs attention.
The book uses that incredible anecdote about the author's classmate who genuinely thought people in India ate monkey brains solely because he'd seen it in an Indiana Jones movie.
It's such a perfect, if cringeworthy, example, right? It shows how a single, fictional, culturally insensitive media reference, when consumed without any critical thinking or counter-narrative, can literally become someone's entire understanding of a huge, diverse group of people.
Yeah.
And that leads directly to an ingrained bias based on a completely false, harmful stereotype accompanied by negative feelings. Or there's another story about a Korean student who had internalized Western beauty standards from media so much that she admitted preferring white friends because they looked like the people on TV.
Wow, that's it.
It really is.
Yeah.
It shows how powerfully media trains our perceptions of beauty, desirability, even self-worth, fueling things like colorism and self-loathing within and between communities of color. And the source points out, Media is often designed to bypass our critical thinking. It uses strong emotions, pleasant or unpleasant, to activate our biology or reward systems to keep us hooked.
Mm-hmm.
It frequently falls back on formulas that valorize certain groups while tokenizing, stereotyping, or even dehumanizing others. And this happens even in content that seems like harmless entertainment.
So if we pull these last three together, our social contact, our formal education, and the media we consume, they all work together, relentlessly reinforcing the stories and policies we talked about earlier. It really does sound like we're being trained in biased habits of mind and feeling from almost every angle.
That's precisely the argument the source makes. It's a pervasive, often invisible, cultural conditioning process. And the source then goes on to describe how this training manifests. Talks about four main forms of bias: internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and systemic. Now, they're all deeply interconnected, of course, but the book excerpts we're drawing from focus quite a bit on internalized and interpersonal bias and how the bigger institutional and systemic forms create the conditions, the environment for those individual experiences to flourish.
Let's start with internalized bias then. What does that actually look like?
Internalized bias is essentially when those harmful mental formations, the stories, the stereotypes, the negative cues we've absorbed, turn inward. It influences our thoughts, our feelings, our actions towards ourselves.
Towards ourselves.
It shapes how we perceive our own identity based on the biases society holds about the groups we belong to. It affects how we think others perceive us. The source connects it strongly to experiences of victimhood, but also, paradoxically, it points out how it can sometimes manifest as a sense of entitlement.
Victimhood and entitlement, how does that work?
Well, the author actually shares some of his own very personal journey processing trauma related to bias, and realizing how an ingrained sense of victimhood could, at times, coexist with or even lead to feeling entitled in certain ways. It highlights that complex internal struggle.
Okay. And interpersonal bias. That seems like the one we maybe talk about most often.
It probably is the most commonly recognized form, yes. This is when those harmful mental formations influence our thoughts, our words, and our actions towards other people. It operates by solidifying a concept of the other, someone different from our own self-concept, and often implicitly or explicitly placing that other lower on that learned hierarchy we've been discussing.
So this is where the apneisms come in.
Exactly. This is where we see racism, sexism, classism, ageism, ableism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, all of those playing out in interactions between people. And it can range from subtle things like perhaps unconscious negative judgments or assumptions, all the way through microaggressions, gaslighting, explicit discrimination, and tragically, physical harm and violence.
The book mentions weapon bias research.
Yes, it highlights that chilling research, showing how studies have found people are more likely to misidentify a harmless object, like a phone or wallet or even a tool, as a weapon if it's held by a person with dark skin compared to a person with light skin.
Wow.
And you can immediately see the potentially lethal consequences of that kind of biased perception in real-world encounters, particularly with law enforcement. The source then briefly touches on institutional and systemic bias. Institutional bias is when these individual biases get embedded within the structures, the rules, the leadership, the culture of specific organizations or institutions, like a company, a school system, a hospital.
And that affects lots of people within that system.
Right. And systemic bias is described as even broader and balanced. It's the consequence of human bias enacted at scale.
Yeah.
It means these biases are so widespread, so ingrained across multiple institutions and societal sectors, that they create disadvantages for entire groups of people. The source points to outcomes like persistent health disparities between different racial groups, vast economic inequality along racial or gender lines, and even connects large-scale environmental issues like climate change back to these pervasive, scaled-up biases rooted in seeing certain groups and nature itself as less valuable or exploitable.
Okay, it's a lot. When you see how deeply bias seems to be embedded historically, culturally, structurally, even inside us, it can feel pretty overwhelming, maybe even hopeless. How does the book suggest we even begin to tackle something this huge?
That's the absolutely critical pivot point in the discussion, and it circles right back to that core, hopeful idea we started with.
That it's learned.
That it's learned, exactly. And because it's learned, it can be unlearned. But, and this is a big but, it's not magic. It requires intentional, conscious effort. It requires consistent practice. It means actively working against those automatic, habitual responses, against that system one thinking, that fast, intuitive processing that cognitive science talks about, which is efficient but so prone to biased shortcuts.
And that's where the PRISM Toolkit comes back in as the
Yeah,
practical how-to.
exactly. The tools within PRISM, mindfulness, perspective taking, individuation, stereotype replacement, prosocial behaviors, they're designed precisely for this work. Mindfulness helps us become aware of those automatic thoughts and feelings as they arise. Perspective taking helps us genuinely try to see the world from another's viewpoint. Stereotype replacement involves consciously challenging and replacing biased associations with more accurate, complex information. Individuation means seeing people as individuals, not just members of a group. These tools are designed to interrupt that reactive, habitual cycle, to bring awareness to what's usually unconscious, and to actively correct the misinformation and the harmful stereotypes we've inevitably absorbed.
It's not just about mental techniques, though, is it? The book emphasizes other qualities.
Oh, absolutely essential. The book stresses that alongside these cognitive tools, cultivating qualities like vulnerability, compassion, loving kindness, and even forgiveness are critical components of this work. The author's own stories about using meditation to process his own trauma related to bias, or having those difficult, vulnerable conversations, like the one described with his professor, they illustrate how these practices aren't just abstract ideals, they're part of the real-life application.
Compassion seems key.
It's particularly highlighted, yes. And not just compassion for ourselves or for people we like. The practice involves intentionally extending compassion to strangers, to people we find difficult, even, the source suggests, to people we actively dislike or feel have harmed us. There's a specific PRISM practice described for cultivating that kind of broad, challenging compassion.
The source also connects this whole endeavor, this work of unlearning bias, to the concept of interbeing. That's often associated with the Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, right?
Yes, exactly. Interbeing is that profound understanding, that deep recognition of the interconnectedness and interdependence of all things, the idea that nothing, absolutely nothing exists in complete isolation.
So how does breaking bias relate to interbeing?
The work of breaking bias, of consciously cultivating inclusion consciousness, is presented as being in direct alignment with this fundamental truth of interbeing. It's about recognizing that our internal state, our biases, our thoughts, our actions, they don't just stay inside us. They ripple outwards. They have real impacts on other people, on communities, on the world. And the source suggests that while systemic change is absolutely necessary, that kind of large-scale change ultimately requires individual transformation as its foundation. It uses the metaphor of tending to and watering the positive seeds within our own consciousness.
So small actions matter.
Yeah, they do. Even seemingly small acts of conscious attention, of kindness, of pausing to challenge our own automatic conditioning, these contribute to that larger potential for societal shift.
It definitely sounds like this is framed as a lifelong journey, you know, not some kind of weekend workshop or quick fix.
Absolutely. The source is very clear about that. These practices are simple in concept: be mindful, be compassionate, challenge stereotypes, but they are not easy. Why? Because they involve going directly against potentially decades of ingrained conditioning.
Right, swimming upstream.
Exactly. But the potential, the vision the book offers if we undertake this work is immense. It's painted as a profound shift away from the patterns of separation, conflict, and suffering that bias creates toward connection, repair, healing, and genuine belonging. Ultimately, it's about embodying the truth of our interbeing, and maybe also the principle of Ubuntu, that beautiful African philosophy, recognizing our shared humanity, the idea that I am because we are.
Wow. We've certainly taken a deep dive today, really guided by the insights from Anu Gupta's Breaking Bias. We've traced some of the historical foundations of exclusion, we've explored those 5 root causes, how stories get turned into policies, and how our culture trains us through social contact, education, and media.
And we looked at how bias shows up internalized within us, playing out interpersonally between us, and embedded in our institutions and systems.
And crucially, we touched on the possibility, the actual practices, for starting to unlearn these deeply ingrained patterns.
Yeah, and really seeing how concepts we often take for granted, like race or rigid gender hierarchies, things sometimes presented as natural or scientific, are fundamentally social constructs. They're built on invented stories, powerfully enforced through policies, and drilled into us through constant cultural conditioning.
It can feel, well, heavy, maybe even a bit overwhelming to confront just how deeply bias seems woven into our history, our systems, and yeah, even our own minds.
It absolutely can feel heavy. But the source material consistently comes back to this. Recognizing that reality, clearly and maybe without beating ourselves up about it, is the essential first step. And that while challenging systemic bias is vital, The ongoing day-to-day work of breaking bias really begins most effectively within each of us, through conscious practice aimed at building awareness, fostering compassion, and just gently, persistently trying to let go of that harmful conditioning.
So here's a thought then, maybe something for you to carry with you from this deep dive today. If bias is fundamentally about these learned habits of the mind and emotions, what is just one small conscious habit? Maybe it's a moment of mindfulness before reacting, maybe it's pausing to question an assumption, or an intentional act of perspective taking or compassion. What's one small thing you could perhaps start cultivating today to gently challenge a bias you might hold, either towards yourself or towards others?